TEDx is Hacking the Farm, a discussion about all the wonderful and amazing ways in which technology and technological innovation is going to transform farming. In the words of the blurb, sorry, I need a pair of glasses to read it, the farm is transforming into a high-performance, high-growth enterprise. It's adding value to crops, turning commodities into products, and moving up the supply chain. The modern farm is a brand with a USP and a target audience. Today's farm is experimenting with new production methods and processes, biotechnology, big data, GPS, drones, and autonomous systems. Even the adjectives are changing. The farm can now be smart, precise, vertical, lean, organic, hydroponic, aeroponic, or aquaponic. The farm, like the future, is not what it used to be. It sounds wonderful, doesn't it? I'm not much of a techie. In fact, I'm not a techie at all. That's why there are no PowerPoint slides. I've always believed that technological innovation should be for a purpose that's grounded in the real lives of people, not more technology just for the sake of more technology. The farm, our slogan says, is not what it used to be. I couldn't agree more. And in that fact lies some of the deepest and most pressing social problems in this country. The real question is whether technology can really change that. Personally, I have my doubts. Unless the techies start thinking about things that are much more important than technology. So what do I mean when I say the farm is not what it used to be? Farming used to be primarily about two things. Firstly, it was about producing the food without which a community could not survive. And secondly, it was about providing a dignified livelihood for the people who produced that food. In that latter respect, South Africa has not met that standard for a very long time. 120 years ago, there was a thriving class of black family-owned and worked farms that produced the bulk of the food for the new towns around South Africa. An apartheid land and labor policy put an end to that. Today, most farm workers live very bleak lives. They earn a pittance. They often live in subhuman conditions. Their lives are also very precarious. Millions and millions of farm workers have been evicted from farms all around the country over the last 25 years, some of them children who were born on those farms. Their livelihoods are also precarious because of seasonal variations in agriculture. The current drought in the Western Cape means that thousands of families have lost their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to earn an income from picking fruit. Cruelest of all, farm worker communities have among the highest levels of food insecurity in South Africa. The people who produce our food are those least likely to be able to afford to eat it. How will technology make these people's lives better? Has anyone even asked themselves that question? Or will we all continue to act as if farm workers and their families simply don't exist? It's not just farm workers and their families that need a better deal. Land restitution and land reform, which are critical to healing the wounds of the past in this country, will never succeed because it is almost impossible for new farmers to make a decent living out of farming. Why? Because the ability to earn a living from farming has been on a steady downward trend for 30 years, and not just in South Africa. Okay? And why is that? It's because the price that the farmers get paid for the food that they produce, as a percentage of the retail price of food, that's what you and I pay when we go to the supermarket, is on a steady downward trend. And it's important for the rest of this story that you remember that when food prices are going up, it's usually not the farmers who are benefiting the most, or sometimes even at all, even though they're often the smokescreen that is used as a reason for why prices have gone up. As just one example, in the latest drought in 2015-2016, we were told that the retail price of milk had gone up because of the drought. The reasoning was that farmers were under pressure to feed their cows, they needed to have a higher income. Now that last part of the story was certainly true. But while the price that you and I paid for milk went up about 3 Rand a litre, the farmers only got an extra 70 cents a litre. And in fact, during the drought, hundreds of dairy farmers went out of business. The farm gate price of milk between what the farmers get and the retail price has been increasing steadily. 12 years ago, it was about 6 Rand a litre. Now it's just over 10 Rand a litre. So that means that when you go to the supermarket and buy a litre of milk for 15 Rand, the farmer who produced it is only getting about 4.50 Rand a litre for that same milk. And it's the same story with almost every single agricultural commodity. You and I pay more and more, and farmers are going out of business because they cannot afford to make a living out of farming. And we need to understand that the implications of this go far beyond just threatening land reform and land restitution and farming enterprises, even though we understand that those are very important issues. Farming's had a lot of bad press because of its often negative impact on the environment. We read about massive feedlots crowded with animals, fed lots of scary things and pumped full of antibiotics. We read about animals being given growth hormones to make them mature in a shorter period of time. We read about lots of water pollution from chemical fertilizer runoff and from those same feedlots. And we think, farmers should be chastised. They should be taught to farm in a more sustainable way. But here's the reality. Farming is an incredibly low margin and precarious business. If you want to stay in business as a farmer, you have no option but to adopt these farming methods. It's not ignorance driving this kind of farming. It's a desperate attempt to survive. How will technology help farmers to get a better deal so that they can afford to farm in a more sustainable and humane way? And then, of course, there's the argument which says we have to have this industrial technology because we have to feed so many billions of people. In South Africa, the proponents of a destructive, inhumane farming system, which treats people as expendable inputs as much as it treats animals as expendable inputs, cite food insecurity and hunger as the reasons why we have to embrace this technology. Certainly no one can argue that we don't have a very serious problem in this country. 3/4 of all South African young children do not meet the minimum standards for nutritional intake. Millions and millions of children go to bed hungry every night. Somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 children die of hunger in this country every year. A shocking statistic that most South Africans are simply unaware of. Did any of you know that every day 15 children die of hunger in the Rainbow Nation? Surely the horrific reality of starvation and hunger means that we need to embrace whatever technology is out there in order to produce more food. Well, here's a newsflash. Unless there's a drought, South Africa already produces enough food for everyone who lives here. It's worth saying again, we already produce enough food for everyone. Despite that fact, millions of people are going hungry or subsisting on a diet that is completely inadequate, or sometimes dying of hunger. And why? Because who gets to eat and who doesn't get to eat in this country depends on how much money people have to buy food relative to the cost of that food, not on how much food there actually is. The nutritional status of a family in Soweto depends on how much money they have to buy food and not on how much food is actually available. And this is where the real social impact of that growing gap between the farm gate price of food and the retail price of food becomes apparent. Mothers on social grants cannot afford to buy their children milk at 15 Rand a litre, and small dairy farmers cannot afford to feed their families because they only get paid 4.20 Rand a litre for that same milk. And don't think that because you are not a farmer or because you are a member of that lucky minority that can afford to feed themselves well, that this is not your problem. We can never address rural poverty and inequality unless we have a better deal for farmers and farm workers. How can we build a thriving and inclusive economy when so many of our children have their ability to learn permanently damaged by hunger? There's overwhelming evidence of a link between severe childhood malnutrition, the kind that affects 1 in 4 children in this country, and an increased propensity for violence in adults through permanent damage to the brain. Lack of food may be the single most important factor explaining our world-class levels of violence. Believe me, this is your problem. It may be your biggest problem. None of this sorry state of affairs has got anything to do with technology or the lack thereof. Instead, it has to do with what we as a society value most and with what we value least. And the truth of the matter is that what we value most is corporate profit, and what we value least are the lives of the poor and the vulnerable. We have forgotten that food is not a commodity or a product or a brand. It is, together with water, the foundation of life. And it's the foundation of social justice. When we condone a society in which so many people go hungry, we're not just damaging their health, we're fundamentally damaging their humanity. When you deny a mother the ability to feed her child who is crying from hunger, you take away part of her humanity. When you force someone to beg for food by the side of the road, you are making a mockery of our collective dreams for ourselves and of a constitution that is only one of a handful in the world that guarantees the right to food. It's not our technology that needs a fix. It's our hearts. If we want change, we need to start thinking about morality in our food system, which means we need to start thinking about the morality that underpins our economy and our society, our deepest held beliefs about right and wrong. I don't believe that any one of us here would watch a child under our care starve to death if we could possibly do something about it. So why is it so different? Because it is someone else's child. I believe we have a moral obligation to see each other, to see and acknowledge the reality of other people's lives. Apartheid succeeded for so long because it was so successful at making us blind to the reality of other people. And we can never build a new kind of society and a new kind of food system while we remain blind to other people. And ignorance is not an excuse. Most South Africans have no idea that children are starving to death in this country every day. But that information is not a state secret. It's relatively easy to find. But first, you have to want to find it. And no amount of technology can compensate for a deficit of morality or for our willful blindness to the suffering of others. Nothing is going to change until we change.